Hello and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. In my last episode, I talked about how people through much of the modern age have not really seemed to see the power of this universal but mostly unconscious yearning for oneness that I've been talking about through most of this series. The problem with this blind spot in modern self-awareness is that this yearning demands to be fed, whether it's consciously recognized or not. And so the human psyche, I said, has been driven to clutch at whatever reminds it of oneness, especially social cohesion, I think. This desperate, blind clutching has resulted in horrors like totalitarianism and genocide, especially in the 20th century. I think today we're somewhat more aware of our need for existential unity. In fact, you see this topic come up a fair bit in self-help media and culture generally. But we continue to struggle for a satisfactory answer, how to attain it. Today I'd like to talk a bit about how and why this blind spot came to be, because I think this will help us see why our struggle to fill this need has been so difficult. I think it can be difficult to see the closed-mindedness of our humanistic and enlightened modern age, enlightened in the sense that the Enlightenment continues to shape it, to shape us. This is partly because we're so inculcated with it ourselves. Humanism and rationalism pervade our time. They're everywhere in our education and our wider culture, in our everyday thoughts and conversations. They're our intellectual and you could even say spiritual mother's milk from an early age. The other reason, I think, is that the principles of humanism and rationalism are themselves compelling. They seem intuitively true in a lot of ways. For example, when the 15th century Italian humanist Pico della Mirandola writes, "Nothing in the cosmos is more worthy of admiration than mankind," he seems to us to be expressing a truth that is in some ways universal. So does François Rabelais, writing in the following century, when he describes in his body and hilarious novel, Gargantua and Pantagruel, this sort of anti-monastery, apparently built to put into practice the idea that humans are naturally good, that we have our innate sort of moral compass. This is why the men and women who inhabit this monastery, a commune, I suppose we could call it now, have no need of rules, and they live virtuously according to their own natural desire. Vice is due not to nature, not to their nature, but it's rather a reaction to the unjust constraints imposed by others. It almost reminds us a bit of Rousseau, who came much later, of course. Anyway, Rabelais writes, "All their life was spent not in laws, statutes, or rules, but according to their own free will and pleasure. They rose out of their beds when they thought good. They did eat, drink, labor, sleep, when they had a mind to it, and were disposed for it. None did awake them. None did offer to constrain them to eat, drink, or to do any other thing. For so Gargantua established it. In all their rule and strictest tie of their order, there was but this one clause to be observed. Do what thou wilt." This English translation is slightly archaic. "Because men that are free, well-born, well-bred, and conversant in honest companies have naturally an instinct and spur that prompteth them unto virtuous actions, and withdraws them from vice, which is called honor. Those same men, when by base subjection and constraint they are brought under and kept down, turn aside from that noble disposition by which they formerly were inclined to virtue, to shake off and break that bond of servitude wherein they are so tyrannously enslaved." So that's Rabelais. Perhaps a better term than humanism for the spirit of our time is individualism. It's not just humanity as a whole that's believed to be essentially good, but specifically the human individual. All of which I think is summed up in a single line from Shakespeare that we're all familiar with. It's that advice given by Polonius to his son Laertes in Shakespeare's Hamlet: "To thine own self be true," which I think has become a motto of the modern age. In a way, it's the principle of the modern age. Polonius's advice implies that acting out of our natural inclinations will inevitably make us both happy and virtuous. And so when we read Descartes' Discourse on Method of 1637, in which he speaks of the development of a new practical philosophy, he calls it, science we would call it today, which would make humans masters of the world by means of the technology it would enable, we feel at home. We feel like we're aware of the prescience of Descartes' thinking. But he sort of feels like one of our spiritual brethren. He writes, "Through this philosophy we could know the power and action of fire, water, air," and here you could just substitute the natural elements that we're more familiar with from, say, the periodic table or whatever. The stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies in our environment as distinctly as we know the various crafts of our artisans. And we could use this knowledge, as the artisans use theirs, for all the purposes for which it is appropriate, and thus make ourselves, as it were, the lords and masters of nature. This is desirable not only for the invention of numerous devices, which would facilitate our enjoyment of the fruits of the earth and all the goods we find there, but also, and more importantly, for the maintenance of health, which is undoubtedly the chief good and the foundation of all the other goods in this life. Descartes' vision doesn't strike us as greedy or overweening, because on some level we understand that as naturally good creatures, we deserve this mastery. That's how I read it anyway. I think other ages might not have seen it this way. They might have seen this as a kind of impiety. Anyway, finally, when we read Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, which famously begins, "Man is born free and everywhere he's in chains," we see ourselves here too, and also a truth that seems universal. We humans deserve to free ourselves by questioning the conventions and overturning the institutions that have kept us from realizing our natural goodness. Excuse me. As I mentioned last time, part of modern humanism has been a vast self-confidence, a sense that humanity's progress and self-enlightenment are inevitable. We still see this today in, for example, the 2018 book Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress by psychology professor Steven Pinker, whom I also spoke about last time. His book's closing image of an upward spiral suggests that the tendency for humans to make themselves better and happier through Enlightenment ideals is pushed along by its own natural impetus. There's a sort of inevitability about it. He writes, "As the spiral of recursive improvement gathers momentum, we eke out victories against the forces that grind us down, not least the darker parts of our own nature. We penetrate the mysteries of the cosmos, including life and mind. We live longer, suffer less, learn more, get smarter, and enjoy more small pleasures and rich experiences. Fewer of us are killed, assaulted, enslaved, oppressed, or exploited by the others. From a few oases, the territories with peace and prosperity are growing and could someday encompass the globe. Much suffering remains and tremendous peril, but ideas on how to reduce them have been voiced, and an infinite number of others are yet to be conceived. We will never have a perfect world, and it would be dangerous to seek one, but there's no limit to the betterments we can attain if we continue to apply knowledge to enhance human flourishing." Excuse me. Today, of course, the fundamental confidence of Western modernity lies not just among a handful of intellectuals. It's come to pervade society and is all around us. I used this image earlier of mother's milk. It's kind of like the air we breathe. Everywhere, notwithstanding the counter-enlightenment or anti-rationalist trends that we've also been noting in this series, and that Pinker notes in his book, there's a sense of inevitability that properly discerning and following our desire and curiosity will make us both happier and better. Individual self-realization, the actualization of our natural goodness and happiness, is assumed to be our goal. Our justice system, in theory at least, aims not at retribution, but at the rehabilitation or re-education of people we take to have been misdirected by distorted thinking from a natural course of positive self-realization or self-actualization. That's why they call it corrections rather than just prisons. We're actually so immersed in this way of thinking that we're unaware of how different it is from the thinking that shaped previous ages. So strong is our belief in our inherent goodness, for example, that to say one is passionate about something says something good about both us and that which we're passionate about. A conception, I think, almost unknown in almost any other human culture. Even in ancient Greece and Rome, which are supposedly the inspirers of modern Western humanism. The word actually comes to us, the word passion, from the Latin passio, which meant suffering, actually. That's why we call the suffering of Christ the passion of Christ. In the classical world, passion generally has a negative connotation, and the Greek word hubris, it's typically translated as pride or insolence nowadays, might better be translated as outrageousness, and it's closely associated with passion for the Greeks. Sophrosune, the moderation of passion, is one of the 4 classical virtues. Something similar has happened with pride, which also used to be a vice, where now it's identity label. It's seen more as a virtue. It's also not easy to see rationalism as closed-minded because the idea that reason, not tradition, for example, is the ultimate arbiter seems the pinnacle or the very incarnation of open-mindedness. An open-mindedness to the arguments of other people. And yet our modern humanism, like a classical tragic hero, has its own hubris and its own tragic flaw. There is, I think, something important that modern Enlightenment culture is closed off to. I've been talking about that, sort of talking around it quite a bit in this series, and now I'd like to kind of address it in what I think is a more direct way. This closedness is partly exactly in the glorious picture of the individual human that we associate with the Renaissance. Glorious in this human individual's self-containedness, ready to conquer the world, to boldly go where no one has gone before, you might say. There's an obvious appeal to this, but we all know it isn't the whole picture. We're talking here about this, you could also say this autonomous individual in the Renaissance, who's capable of being his or her own steersperson, somebody who has their own inner compass, which was really a new idea. But as Harvard philosophy professor Christine Korsgaard has written, human beings seem psychologically damaged in ways that suggest some deep break with nature. There is a self-containedness to us all. It's not just wrong, this Renaissance picture, but there is also a rivenness, an alienation from both nature and ourselves. And part of this closed-offedness of Enlightenment thinking is a being closed off from altered states of consciousness, unitive states, that are, of course, related to this alienation. The writings of the Enlightenment philosophers seem entirely devoid of awareness of these states, or at least awareness of them as being of value for us. I think they would really associate them with irrational experiences like passion or superstition that a more the more they would see them as the more superstitious elements of religion. Somehow, in their zeal to free human beings from the constraints of nature and society by the power of reason, the Enlightenment philosophers themselves came to understand the human individual as essentially the reasoning ego, the everyday self, a self-contained subject, opposed to objects. There's a sense that the individual has a fixed nature with stateable needs. And so the fulfillment of the individual's desire is taken to lie in the attainment of these stateable objectives. Of course, there's a sense in which this is, again, obviously true. This is really our everyday life in a nutshell. We figure out what we want and then we go after it. But of course, there's more to our lives than the everyday. And reason actually isn't the best guide to our most important decisions. In a 2022 book, Wild Problems, A Guide to the Decisions That Define Us, Stanford economist Russ Roberts says, some decisions can't be made based on objective reasoning. He writes, the big decisions we face in life, the wild problems, whether to marry, who to marry, whether to have children, what career path to follow, how much time to devote to friends and family, how to resolve daily ethical dilemmas. These big decisions can't be made with data or science or the usual rational approaches. And he writes, this isn't because we don't have enough data. It's rather by their very nature that these decisions can't be made based on quantifiable things. They can't, he says, be made based on the assumption that, quote, nothing is of infinite value, unquote. Likewise, with respect to that advice Polonius gave in Hamlet, there's an obvious wisdom to this advice and a beauty to how it's voiced in Shakespeare. Yet, how does one be true to oneself? How do you actually action that? I mean, in a sense, I'm whatever I choose to do. Myself is changing every instant. I decide what myself is. It's like that advice for dates and job interviews to just be yourself. In an obvious sense, I can't not be myself. In this connection, I think it's worth pondering whether this advice was really, whether Polonius was really a mouthpiece for Shakespeare here or not. He is actually the buffoon in Hamlet. And so this may not have come from the mind of Shakespeare himself. I mean, as his own advice to his fellow humans. It may even have been a kind of critique of what he saw as an imperfect idea. Assuming that everything has a finite value, that the satisfaction of our desires lies in these stateable objectives, doesn't come close to capturing what it is to be human, I don't think. This everyday kind of living is, in a sense, one of alienation, because there'll never be an end of objectives that we're separated from. We're separated from them by not having yet attained them. And of course, as we've seen in this series, it's not clear that human desire is actually ultimately satisfied in this way anyway. Do we really live for the satisfaction of these finite goals? Or it's kind of like a laundry list. Do we live for a laundry list, or is it rather not that our motivation to live comes out of a sense of being, as the writer C.S. Lewis put it, surprised by joy? And I'm reminded in this of a passage from the 2002 novel Kafka on the Shore, that you might be familiar with, and by the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami. In this scene, the wise librarian Oshima is having a conversation with Kafka. He's the runaway teenager of the book's title. He calls himself Kafka. And Oshima says, from my own experience, when someone is trying very hard to get something, they don't. And when they're running away from something as hard as they can, it usually catches up with them. I'm generalizing, of course. And Kafka replies, if you generalize about me, then what's in my future if I'm seeking and running at the same time? That's a tough one, Oshima says and smiles. A moment passes before he goes on. If I had to say anything, it'd be this. Whatever it is you're seeking won't come in the form you're expecting. This reminds me also of these terms of Abraham Maslow, deficient cognition and being cognition. Enlightenment thinking seems to assume that deficiency cognition suffices for humanity. This cognition where we're trying to solve these problems about what we need, about the things that we see ourselves as deficient in. Whereas being cognition is the cognition of being as it is. Enlightenment thinking makes no space for being cognition, or in other words, that we might find satisfaction in a different way from the attainment of objectives. Not only satisfaction, we might be able to feel joy in our very being itself, an ecstasy from which we are somehow closed off in our ordinary waking lives. So this is where the states of consciousness come in. You may remember that Freud said that the boundaries of the ego are not fixed. This joy may reside in the thought that the subject-object world isn't necessarily the truest one, and that the object of our desire may, as paradoxically as it may seem, have to do with the transcendence or overcoming of the subject-object divide itself. It may have to do with a different state of consciousness. This sense of ecstasy that lies precisely in not being self-contained it's captured beautifully in art of all kinds through the ages, I think. Here's a nice example it's from the 1910 poem by the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore called Stream of Life. The same stream of life that runs through my veins, night and day, runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measures. It is the same life that shoots in joy through the dust of the earth in numberless blades of grass and breaks into tumultuous waves of leaves and flowers. It is the same life that is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and of death, in ebb and in flow. I feel my limbs are made glorious by the touch of this world of life, and my pride is from the life throb of ages dancing in my blood this moment. Tagore also wrote in his 1916 novel, The Home and the World, man's life was not meant to be cast in a mould, and if we try to shape the good as so much mere material, it takes a terrible revenge by losing its life. I think this is really the blind spot of the modern West. And we've seen in this series, or at least it's been my attempt to show, that when the good loses its life, bad things happen, both to individuals and to societies. And so a lot of this series will be exploring how Plato tries to teach us to keep the good alive. In my next episode, I'd like to talk about where all this leaves us. Thanks again for watching, and see you next time.